The year was 1887, and the Arizona Territory was baking under a sun that offered no mercy. Dust Creek was a town caught in the teeth of progress, a place that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. It huddled along a dry riverbed, squeezed between the established cattle ranges and the raw, scarring promise of the railroad coming through from the east. The air was seldom still. It carried the fine red grit of the desert, which coated every windowsill, settled in the bottom of every water barrel, and gave the back of the throat a permanent scratch. The afternoon stagecoach was late, which was nothing new. When it finally appeared, a rattling shape emerging from the shimmering heat, it seemed to be held together by little more than dried mud and stubbornness. It lurched to a halt in front of the Dust Creek livery, the horses heaving, their hides dark with sweat. A few men on the boardwalk of the general store paused their whittling to watch. It was an event. The driver climbed down, cracking his back, and spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the street. He opened the door with a groan of warped wood. One passenger, a drummer with a melted collar, stumbled out first, coughing. Then came the woman. She emerged slowly, one hand gripping the doorframe, the other clutching a small, worn carpet bag. The men on the porch fell silent. This was Juniper Hale. The whispers had arrived 2 days before the coach, traveling faster than any horse. She was a mail-order bride, and the rumors that preceded her painted her as something wild, perhaps even ruined. She stood for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the brutal light. She was younger than the gossip had allowed, perhaps just past 20. She was coated in the same red dust as the coach, her traveling dress dark with grime and exhaustion. But she held her head high, her gaze sweeping the small collection of buildings with an intensity that was almost unnerving. In her hand, wrapped tightly around her wrist, was a length of faded blue silk, a scarf that seemed impossibly delicate in this harsh place. She was looking for a sign. She was looking for a man. Further down the street, standing in the thin shade of the land office overhang, a man waited. He was tall, but he held himself with a stillness that made him easy to overlook. This was Elijah Redhawk, known to the town simply as Eli. He was the owner of the Cottonwood Ranch, a small holding a few miles out. He was a man of mixed blood, Apache and Yavapai from his mother, white from a father long gone. He had served as a frontier scout in his younger days, but those who knew him now knew him only as a man of profound calm, a man who spoke little and famously hated violence. He lived alone. He held a piece of rough board in his hands, simple lettering burned into it, A. Hale. Eli was not waiting for a bride. He was waiting for the new seasonal schoolteacher, a widow named Mrs. Hale, who the territorial registrar had promised would arrive before the fall term. He had agreed to house her at his ranch until the small schoolhouse dormitory was repaired. Juniper saw him. She saw the sign, J. Hale. Her breath caught. This was him, the man from the letters. She had paid the agency half the travel fee, a sum that had cost her everything. This man, this stranger, was her anchor. She picked up her trunk, a heavy, battered thing, and began to drag it through the ankle-deep dust toward him. Eli watched her approach, his brow furrowing. This was not the middle-aged widow he had been led to expect. This was a young woman, tired to the bone, with eyes that looked like they had seen too much. But the sign read, J. Hale. And here she was. Mr. Redhawk, she asked. Her voice was hoarse from the dust. He nodded slowly. Mrs. Hale, he replied, his voice soft. He kept the title respectful. He motioned to her trunk. That is all you have. It is. She said she would not meet his eyes. She was focused on the sign he held, the proof of their contract. Eli felt a prickle of unease. The town was watching. From across the street, Sheriff Amos Gray stood in the doorway of his office, a man worn down by the heat and the petty squabbles of a town balanced on a knife edge. He was a fair man, but he looked tired. He nodded once to Eli, a simple acknowledgement. Further down, Reverend Pike, the town's spiritual guide, was sweeping the steps of his small church. He paused, leaning on his broom, and offered a smile that did not reach his eyes. Pike was a man of two faces, one for Sunday and one for the rest of the week. The real power in Dust Creek was not visible, but he was felt. Colonel Silas Calder. His name was on the largest cattle ranch in the valley, and he was the head agent for the incoming railroad. He decided who got water, who got freight contracts, and who was run out of the territory. The whispers said he had a hand in everything, from land prices to the mail. Eli knew all this. He knew the way these men looked at a woman arriving alone, especially one with the mail order tag hanging on her. He knew the way they looked at him, the half-breed rancher who kept to himself. This town was thick with prejudice, a quiet, simmering stew of it. They distrusted the ordered brides as goods of low quality, and they distrusted his native blood as something unpredictable. He turned his attention back to the woman. He saw the tremor in her hands. He saw the blue scarf, a desperate patch of color. "Let me take that," he said, his voice gentle. He lifted the heavy trunk as if it weighed nothing and swung it onto the back of his waiting buckboard. He turned and offered her his hand. June hesitated. This was not the man she had pictured. The letters had been blunt, practical, written by a man who wanted a wife to run a house. This man seemed quiet, kind. His hand was steady. She took it, and he helped her up onto the wooden seat. He untied the reins and clicked his tongue. The mule team started, and the buckboard pulled away from the livery, leaving the whispers to flower in their wake. The ride to Cottonwood Ranch was mostly silent. The clatter of the wheels and the jingle of the harness filled the hot air. The landscape was brutal, all rock and yucca and baked earth. June held onto the seat, her knuckles white. She was terrified. This was the gamble of her life. Eli did not press her for conversation. He understood the toll the journey took. He kept his eyes on the trail, his hands light on the reins. He could feel her fear, a vibration next to him, as sharp as the heat. After nearly an hour, the trail dipped into a shallow valley. The change was immediate. Here, a small, steady creek ran, and along its banks grew a grove of massive, ancient cottonwood trees. Their leaves shimmered green in the unrelenting sun. A miracle of shade. Tucked beneath them was a small, solid house built of river stone and timber. This was Cottonwood Ranch. Eli pulled the buckboard to a halt near the porch. The shade was a physical relief, a cool blanket dropping over their shoulders. "We are here," he said. He stepped down and came around to her side. Again, he offered his hand. She took it, sliding down, her legs unsteady on the solid ground. "The air is different here," she murmured, breathing in the smell of damp earth and green leaves instead of dry dust. "It is the water," Eli said. He gestured to the porch. "Please, sit. I will bring you water." He went to the well, his movements economical and sure. He returned with a tin dipper, full to the brim. He had drawn it from the bucket, not the barrel, knowing it would be colder. June took it with both hands and drank deeply. It was the best water she had ever tasted. It was clean. She sank onto a wooden bench on the porch, the deep shade of the cottonwoods protecting her from the sun. She watched as he effortlessly carried her trunk inside. He returned a moment later. "I am starting a fire in the stove," he said. "It is hot, but I will make coffee, and there is cornbread from this morning." June nodded, overwhelmed by the simple, decent acts. She had been prepared for anything, for coarseness, for demands. She was not prepared for quiet courtesy. She watched him through the open doorway. He moved around the small, clean kitchen with purpose. He was a man accustomed to solitude. "The schoolhouse is in poor shape," Eli said from inside, his voice slightly muffled. "The roof leaked in the last rain. We will need to fix it before you can start." June froze. Schoolhouse. She stood up and walked to the doorway, clutching the blue scarf in her fist. "Schoolhouse," she repeated. Eli turned from the stove. a piece of firewood in his hand. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and the confusion that had been sitting at the back of his mind moved to the front. "Yes," he said slowly. "For the children, you are Mrs. J. Hale, the new teacher." A cold dread washed over June, far colder than the well water. She felt the blood drain from her face. "No," she whispered. "No, I am not. I am Juniper Hale. I am here to be married." Eli's face remained still, but his eyes hardened slightly, not with anger, but with a sudden, sharp understanding. He understood the whispers at the livery. He understood her fear. He set the wood down carefully. "I did not send for a bride," he said. His voice was flat, final. "But the sign," she said, her voice rising with the panic. "It said J. Hale. The agency said a man from Dust Creek, a rancher." "I was waiting for the teacher," he repeated, his gaze unwavering. "I do not seek a wife." The silence that fell was heavier than the heat. June stumbled back, catching herself on the doorframe. She was in a strange town, in a strange man's house, with no money, no connections, and no contract. The man who was supposed to meet her was not here, and this man, this quiet, native man who had shown her the first kindness in weeks, thought she was someone else entirely. The red dust of the street seemed to swirl around the porch, a cloud of gossip and uncertainty. She looked down at the blue silk scarf in her hand. It was the last piece she had of her sister, Maddie, the reason she had gambled everything to come to this desolate land. Maddie, who had disappeared somewhere in this very territory 6 months ago. "Then who?" June whispered, her throat tight. "Did I come here to marry?" Eli looked past her, out toward the trail that led back to Dust Creek, a town run by men like Calder. He knew, with a sinking feeling, that the answer to her question would be found there, and it would not be a good one. The wind picked up, rustling the cottonwood leaves, and for the first time, the shade felt cold. Eli looked at the red dust settling on his porch, then back at the woman. Her panic was a raw, open thing. He was a man who prized quiet, and this woman was the opposite of quiet. She was a storm that had just walked onto his land. "I do not know who you came to marry," he said, his voice measured. "But the postmaster will. If a contract was sent, he handled the mail." He turned, not waiting for her agreement, and walked back to the buckboard. The simple, kind gestures of moments before were gone. He was still not unkind, but he was closed. He was a man bracing himself. June stood frozen for a beat, the relief of the shade and the cold water evaporating. She was adrift again. She hurried after him, climbing back onto the hard wooden seat without his help. The mule team, sensing the tension, flicked their ears. The ride back to Dust Creek was faster than the ride out. Eli pushed the mules, his jaw set. June's mind raced. She had spent every cent she had, half the fee to the agency, the other half for the stage ticket and food. She had nothing. She was ruined. If this man turned her out, she would be on the street. And she knew what happened to women on the street in a town like this. She clutched the blue scarf. She had not just come here to marry. She had come here because this was the last place Maddie's letters had come from. The marriage contract was a lie, a desperate shield to give her legitimate business in this territory while she searched for her sister. And now the shield was gone. They pulled up to the post office, which was also the general store and the land office. It was the center of Dust Creek's nervous system. The heat of the afternoon was peaking. The men who had been watching before were still watching. Eli tied the reins and stepped down. He did not look at June. "Wait here." She watched him walk inside, his back straight. He moved with a quiet economy that was almost unnerving. Inside, the store smelled of dry beans, cured tobacco, and floor polish. Mr. Slocum, the postmaster, was sorting letters behind a wire cage. He was a small man who wore a green visor indoors. "Eli?" He nodded, his eyes darting to the buckboard outside. He had seen the woman. Everyone had. "I was expecting a letter. Eli said, "from the territorial registrar, about the teacher." Slocum licked his thumb and shuffled through a stack. "Ah, yes, it came yesterday. I was meaning to send it out." He pushed a thin envelope through the bars. Eli took it. He opened it. His face did not change, but he read the contents twice. He looked up at Slocum. "It says here, Mrs. Hale. The teacher fell ill. She is not coming." "Is that so?" Slocum said, trying to seem disinterested. "A pity. We need that school." "Yes," Eli said. His voice was low. "It seems there has been a significant mistake." He paused. "Mr. Slocum, you handle all the agency contracts that come through here? The railroad? The male brides?" Slocum's face tightened. "That is private business, Eli." "A woman is outside in my wagon," Eli said, his voice dropping lower still. "She believes she has a contract. She paid a fee. She arrived today. Her name is Juniper Hale." Slocum's eyes flickered. He could not help it. He glanced toward the back of the store, toward the door that led to Colonel Calder's office. "I would not know anything about that," Slocum whispered. "Who placed the order?" Eli's voice was not loud, but it cut through the smell of the beans. "Eli, I cannot." "Who?" Slocum swallowed. He looked at Eli's dark eyes, the eyes of a man who had been a scout, a man who knew how to wait. He leaned forward. It was the colonel. He hissed. "Colonel Calder, he placed the order 2 months ago, paid in full for passage, said he was expanding his household staff." Eli stood very still. "Calder, of course, the man who collected things, land, water rights, political favors, and now, it seemed, women?" He knew what household staff meant at a place like Calder House, a ranch run by rough men without wives. He turned and walked out. The sun hit him like a fist. June looked at his face, and her last hope died. "It was Colonel Calder," he said, stopping by the wagon. He did not look at her. He looked down the street, toward the large, imposing office of the Calder Cattle Company. June's blood ran cold. Calder, the name sounded like power. The name sounded like iron. "I paid half the fee," she whispered, mostly to herself. "The agency, they said he was a widower, a rancher." "He is a rancher," Eli said grimly. "He ranches most of this valley." June felt a wave of dizziness. She put her hand out to steady herself against the side of the wagon. Her fingers brushed the rough, sun-baked wood of the station wall. Her knuckles scraped against something dry and gritty. Charcoal. She looked down, hidden in the deep shadow by a water barrel, where the stagecoach always stopped. Someone had drawn a letter. It was a single, stylized M. She sucked in her breath. She knew that letter. She would know it anywhere. It was Maddie's, her sister, who had always fancied herself an artist, who filled the margins of every book with drawings. It was her signature. She looked closer, her heart pounding against her ribs. It was not just the letter. There was a small, faint arrow drawn next to it. It pointed east, out of town, toward the hills, toward the vast expanse of land that she now knew belonged to Colonel Calder. This was not a mistake. This was not a coincidence. Calder had ordered her, and Maddie's last sign, a desperate breadcrumb, pointed straight to his door. A sudden, violent gust of wind hit the street. It was not a breeze. It was a wall of air that lifted the red dust from the ground and threw it in their faces. The sky, which had been a clear, brutal blue, was turning a sickly yellow to the west. Eli looked up, sniffing the air. "Get in," he said, his voice urgent. "What is it?" "Dust storm. A bad one. He was already untying the reins." As if summoned, Sheriff Amos Gray stepped out of his office, pulling his hat down low. He was a man who looked like he had not slept in a week. He walked over, squinting against the rising wind. "Eli," he said, nodding. He glanced at June, his gaze professional but tired. "Ma'am." "Sheriff," Eli said. "Sky is closing up. The sheriff said, "This is going to be a long one. You two heading back out?" "I am," Eli said. He did not elaborate. Sheriff Gray looked at June. He looked at her worn carpet bag, her pale face, and the blue scarf wrapped around her wrist. He knew she was the mail-order bride. He knew Calder had been expecting her. He also knew Eli. "Eli," the sheriff said, lowering his voice so only they could hear over the wind's rising scream. "The hotel is no place for her, not with Calder's men drinking there, and she cannot stay on the street. It was not a suggestion. It was a request from the law. Take her back to Cottonwood. It is the only safe place, just until this blows over." Eli looked at the sheriff. He saw the bind the man was in. He looked at June, who was watching the M on the wall as if it were a ghost. He wanted no part of this. He wanted nothing to do with Colonel Calder. Taking this woman, the woman Calder had paid for, was like walking into a den of rattlesnakes and stealing their dinner. It was an act of war. But he could not leave her. He could not, in his own conscience, leave her to the mercy of Calder or the storm. "Get in the wagon, Miss Hale," he said, his voice flat. June tore her eyes from the wall and scrambled onto the seat. The ride back was a nightmare. Within minutes, the world vanished. The sun was gone, blotted out by a swirling, howling wall of red grit. The wind shrieked, a physical force that tried to peel them from the wagon. June covered her face with the blue scarf, but the dust was in her mouth, her eyes, her lungs. Eli did not slow down. He knew this trail as well as he knew his own hand. He leaned forward, his shoulders hunched against the assault, his eyes fixed on the faint impression of the road. He was the only solid thing in a world that was coming apart. They burst into the ranch yard, the mules desperate for the barn. Eli hauled June from the wagon, half carrying her as they ran for the house. They slammed the stone door shut, and the sound of the storm was instantly muffled, reduced to a high, thin wail at the windows. The small house was dark. Dust was already finding its way under the door. "They will talk," June said, her voice a raw cough. She pulled the gritty scarf from her face. "The whole town, they saw you take me." "Let them talk," Eli said. He went to the stove and lit a lantern. The yellow light pushed back the gloom. His face was a mask of caked red dust, his eyes clear and dark beneath. "They call you the wildest bride. They will call me a fool, or worse, for harboring you." He turned to her. The set of his jaw was hard. "You can stay here until the storm passes. It might be 2 days, it might be 3. That room," he pointed to a closed door, "is yours. The door has a solid bolt. You will use it." June met his gaze. She saw the iron in him, but it was not the iron of Calder. It was something else, strength. "I am not the man you were sent for. Miss Hale," he said clearly. "I am not your husband. You are a guest. You will be safe in this house. Nothing more is offered. Nothing more will be taken. Do you understand?" "I understand," she whispered. "Good." He turned away, already moving to check the shutters. June went to the room. It was simple, furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a wooden chair. It was meticulously clean. Through the wall, she could hear him moving, securing the barn, tending the animals he had managed to get inside. She opened her small carpet bag. Her hands were shaking. From beneath her few items of clothing, she pulled a thin, sharp dagger in a worn leather sheath. It was her last line of defense. She checked the bolt on the door. It was new, well-oiled, solid. She slid the dagger under the thin pillow. She sat on the bed, the sound of the wind filling her ears. She was trapped in this house with a stranger, trapped in this town by the storm, and trapped by the mystery of her sister. Hours passed. The storm did not lessen. It screamed, a constant, maddening noise. Night fell, but it made no difference to the red darkness outside. Eli made coffee and brought her a cup, leaving it outside her door after knocking. He did not try the handle. He left bread and beans on the kitchen table. They did not speak. Later, deep in the night, a new sound joined the wind, a sharp, Repetitive thud, thud, thud. June's door opened a crack. She saw Eli, lamp in one hand, his rifle in the other. He had not been sleeping. "Stay in your room," he whispered. He moved to the main door. The thudding had stopped. The wind howled. He stood by the door, listening. Then, a heavy slam, like a fist, pounded on the wood. Eli moved with sudden speed. He unbarred the door and swung it open, rifle leveled. Nothing, only the howling red night. The air was so thick with dust he could not see the barn. He stepped out onto the porch, bracing himself, the rifle sweeping the darkness. He saw them then, just shadows in the maelstrom. 2 riders on horseback, already at the edge of his property, disappearing toward the main road. They had come and gone like ghosts. He looked down. The pounding had not been at the door. It had been at the post next to it. Driven deep into the solid cottonwood frame with a heavy skinning knife was a square of thick rawhide. He pulled the knife free. It was heavy, balanced. He held the rawhide to the lantern light. Burned into it was a brand, a simple, stark C, the Calder brand. Eli closed the door. Barring it, he turned, the rawhide in his hand. June was standing in her doorway, her own knife in her hand. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She saw the brand. "He knows," she said. "He knows," Eli agreed. The message was clear. "She is mine. Give her back." Eli looked at the rawhide, then at her. He wanted peace. He had built his life around it. He had left the violence of the scouts behind. He wanted to ranch, to live by the water, to be left alone. This woman was a declaration of war he had never asked for. June stepped fully into the kitchen. The fear was still there, but something else was burning hotter. "I am not here for him," she said, her voice shaking but hard. "I am here for my sister, Maddie. She came to this territory 6 months ago. She was supposed to be a governess for a family near Silver City. Then her letters stopped." She pointed toward the door, that mark at the station, the M. It was hers. I would know it anywhere. It pointed east. It pointed to his land. He did not just order a bride. Mr. Redhawk, he ordered me, and I think he knows why. Eli looked at the desperation in her face. He saw the blue scarf. He saw the dagger. He was trapped by the storm, by the sheriff, and now by his own decency. He could not turn her out. "The storm will hold for at least 2 days," he said, his voice flat. He tossed the rawhide square onto the table. "You are safe here until it passes. I will help you until the storm passes." It was a small promise, finite, but it was the only thing she had in the world. "Thank you," June whispered. Eli nodded, his face grim in the lamplight. "Bolt your door. Miss Hale." He turned to the window, staring out at the red darkness, feeling the weight of the war that had just been declared on his quiet, lonely ranch. The storm howled for 2 full days. The stone house became an island in a roaring, red ocean of dust. The wind screamed at the shutters, and a fine grit settled on every surface, a fine red snow that tasted of the desert. Inside, Juniper and Eli moved in a tight, suffocating silence. The rawhide square with Calder's brand sat on the kitchen table, a declaration of war that neither of them knew how to answer. They were prisoners, trapped not only by the storm, but by each other. On the first evening, Eli cooked. He moved with the same quiet economy she had first noticed, a man who wasted no motion. He opened a tin of beans, added water and salt pork, and let it simmer on the stove. The small heat was a comfort against the wail of the wind. He set 2 tin plates on the table. He ladled a portion onto his own plate. Then he turned to hers. He hesitated, then added a second, larger ladle of beans. He said nothing. He slid the plate across the table, his eyes on the wall. June ate. She was starving, and the food was hot and real. Later, she saw him fill a large kettle with water and place it on the porch, in a small alcove sheltered from the main force of the wind. He left it there. She looked at him, confused. "For washing," he said, his voice low. He did not look at her. "The well is not fit to use in this wind. It will be cooler in the morning." She understood. It was for her, a private courtesy, an acknowledgement that she was a woman, trapped in his house. It was an act of profound, unspoken decency. She felt a sting behind her eyes, the first in a very long time. On the second day, the wind slackened, but the air remained thick and yellow, the sun a pale coin in a dirty sky. A new sound joined the storm, a steady, determined knocking. Eli had been cleaning his rifle. He set it down, his body instantly alert. He motioned for June to step back, into the shadow of her doorway. He picked up the rifle and moved to the door. The knocking came again, louder. "Mr. Redhawk, a moment, for the Lord's sake!" Eli's shoulders relaxed, but only slightly. He unbarred the door. Reverend Pike stood on the porch, his black coat covered in a film of grit. He held his hat against his chest, a look of pious concern etched onto his face. "My son," Pike boomed, his voice trying to overcome the wind, "I feared for you. I was in town, visiting the mercantile, and the good sheriff mentioned you had a guest. I came to offer prayer. A terrible thing, to be trapped so—" His eyes were not on Eli. They were sliding past him, scanning the dark interior of the house, looking for her. "We are safe, Reverend," Eli said. His voice was flat, and he did not move from the doorway. He was a stone wall. "Praise be," Pike said. "But the poor woman, Miss Hale, it must be terribly compromising." June stepped out of the shadow. She would not be spoken of as if she were a side of bacon. "I am quite well. Reverend, thank you for your concern." Pike's smile widened, but his eyes went cold. He had seen her. That was what he had come for. "Ah, my child, the lost lamb. Let us pray together." He pushed his way inside, not waiting for an invitation. Eli stepped back, his face a mask of granite. He despised this man, but to refuse him entry would be a declaration the town was not ready for. "Let us bow our heads," Pike said, clasping his own hands. He stood in the center of the small room, his presence filling it. Eli bowed his head, but his eyes were open, watching. June did the same. "O Lord," Pike intoned, "we ask your guidance for these two souls, trapped by the tempest. We pray for their strength. We pray for the young woman, Juniper, who has traveled so far from home, only to find herself lost and in a precarious situation. We ask that you guide her from temptation and deliver her to those who are responsible for her." It was not a prayer. It was a threat. It was a message from Calder. June's eyes were fixed on the man, as he raised his hands for a final, dramatic amen. His coat sleeve pulled back. On his right hand, he wore a heavy silver ring, dark with tarnish. It was carved with a crest, a stylized eagle holding a set of scales in its talons. June's breath caught in her throat. She knew that mark. It was the identical, intricate symbol embossed on the letterhead from the mail-order bride agency in St. Louis. The agency that had taken her money. The agency that had sent her to Calder. Pike finished, his eyes snapping open. He beamed at them. "There, the Lord is with you. I will tell the town I have seen you, and that you are both secure. Good day, my son, Miss Hale." He bustled out, letting the gritty wind swirl in before Eli could bar the door behind him. June looked at Eli, her hands shaking. He wasn't here to pray. "No," Eli said. He was wiping the grit from his rifle. "He was here to spy, to make sure I was still here, to make sure you had not sent me away." "I know." "That ring," she said, her voice a dry whisper. "The one he was wearing. It was the symbol of the agency, the one that arranged my contract." Eli stopped wiping the rifle. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a cold, reluctant understanding. The preacher was in on it. The town's holy man was a part of it. On the third morning, they awoke to silence. The wind was gone. The world was still, buried under a layer of red dust. Eli opened the door. The air was cool and clean. The cottonwood trees stood as if nothing had happened, their leaves washed. "We need water," he said. "The wellhead will be full of silt." He took 2 buckets and started for the well, which sat 100 yards from the house. June followed, needing to be out of the stone room. They did not get far. 2 men on horseback were sitting between the house and the well. They were not hiding. They were waiting. They wore Calder's brand on their chaps. "That is far enough. Eli," one of them called out. He was a heavy man with a sun-scorched face. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "This here is private property." June stopped. Eli did not. He kept walking, the bucket swinging loosely in his hands. "This is my well. Jace, you know that. The colonel, he says this whole creek bed is his, and everything on it." The man's eyes slid to June. "And everyone, he is wondering when you are going to return his property." He rested his hand on the butt of his pistol, a casual gesture that was not casual at all. Eli did not break stride. He did not reach for his own weapon, which June saw was holstered at his hip. He simply walked, his gaze fixed on the man. He was tall, and his stillness was more threatening than any weapon. He stopped about 10 feet from the horses. "Move," Eli said. The word was not loud, but it cut through the morning air. The rider, Jace, looked at his partner. This was not how this was supposed to go. They expected the half-breed to argue, or to be afraid. They did not expect this quiet, unmovable presence. To draw on him now would be murder, and even in Dust Creek. That meant the sheriff would have to get involved. Eli took one more step. The man's horse tossed its head, sensing the tension. "Ah, hell," Jace grumbled, his confidence broken. "Water is probably full of dirt anyway. The colonel just wanted you to know he is waiting." He yanked his horse's head around, and the 2 men rode off, slow and insolent. Eli said nothing. He did not watch them go. He knelt by the well, cleaned the silt from the cover, and drew a fresh, clean bucket of water. Later that day, the air clear, they rode to town. The street was a mess of drifted dust and broken branches. June went straight to the post office. Mr. Slocum, the postmaster, was sweeping red grit out his front door. He squinted at her. "Storm is over. Ma'am, I expect you will be moving on." "I need to check the delivery ledger," June said, her voice firm. "I am looking for information on my sister, M. Hale. She had mail sent here about 6 months ago." Slocum bristled. "Now, that is private postal business. I cannot." "I was a printer's apprentice for 4 years, June said, cutting him off. Her voice was cold. "I know how to read a ledger, and I know a United States postmaster is a federal agent who is required to assist in the locating of missing persons." She had no idea if that was true, but it sounded official. Slocum's face went pale. He looked around, nervous. Well, he grumbled, but he went behind the counter and hauled a massive, dust-covered book onto the wooden top. June's fingers moved with expert speed. She was not lying about being a printer. She knew these books. She flipped back the pages, past the recent entries, back 6 months, 7. There. M. Hale. A parcel. M. Hale. A letter. M. Hale. Another parcel. Each one had been signed for. "Who signed for these?" she asked, her finger on the barely legible scrawl. Slocum leaned in, relieved to be helpful. "Oh, that is one of Colonel Calder's men. He picks up all the mail for the ranch." June felt the floor drop out from under her. "The delivery address," she whispered, her finger tracing the column. "What does it say?" "Calder House," Slocum said, pointing. "It all went to Calder House." She stumbled out into the sunlight, feeling sick. Eli was waiting with the wagon. He took one look at her white face and knew he was receiving her mail. She said, her voice dead. All of it. She was there. She is there. The ride back to Cottonwood Ranch was silent. But it was a different silence than before. The truce of the storm was over. As the shadows of the cottonwoods fell over them, Eli stopped the wagon. He turned to her, his face hard. "You need to tell me the truth. Miss Hale, all of it." And so she did. She told him everything, that the mail-order bride contract was a lie, a cover, a desperate, half-cocked plan to get to Dust Creek with a legitimate reason, to search for Maddie. She confessed she had seen the posting for the teacher, J. Hale, and had used the name, hoping to blend in, never imagining the teacher would not arrive and that he would be there. Waiting. Eli's face darkened. He got down from the wagon, his movements stiff. "You lied to me," he said, his voice a low, angry rumble. "I was desperate," she pleaded, climbing down to face him. "You brought this trouble to my door. You brought Calder's men. You brought that preacher. You used my name. You used my ranch." He was angry, truly angry. It was a still, hot anger that was more frightening than shouting. "I know," she said, tears of shame and frustration welling in her eyes. "I know. And I am sorry. I will leave. I will go to Calder House myself. You have done more than enough." "You will do no such thing," he snapped. "You will be dead or worse before you get to the gate. You think he is a fool." He was furious. He felt used, tricked. His quiet life, the peace he had built with stone and water and solitude, was gone. But he looked at her, this small, fierce woman, and he could not unsee the things he had seen. The ring on Pike's hand, the M at the station, the ledger, the terror in her eyes. He turned his back on her and began unhitching the mules. He was angry, but he had not told her to leave. He was not abandoning her. That evening, the tension was a third person in the room. June found her small sewing kit. She took Eli's work shirt, the one that had been torn at the shoulder when a branch snapped in the storm. She sat by the window in the fading light, and her hands, the hands of a printer, made small, perfect, invisible stitches. She heard a noise on her porch. Eli was there. He was working on the latch of her door. It had not been broken, but it had been loose. He was tightening the screws, oiling the bolt. He was making it stronger, making it silent. She finished the shirt and left it on his chair. He came in, saw it, and touched the mend. He said nothing. Later, as darkness fell, June came out of her room. She was holding a heavy, old pistol. It had been in the bottom of her trunk. Eli looked at it. "Can you use it?" "My father taught me, a little." He nodded. He walked outside, into the twilight. He found 3 empty bottles and set them on a fence rail, 50 feet away. "Show me," he said. She raised the heavy gun with both hands. Her arms were shaking. She fired. The explosion was loud in the quiet valley. The bullet kicked up dust a foot to the left. Again, he said. She fired. The bullet went high. "You are pulling the trigger. You are anticipating the noise. Squeeze. Do not pull. Let the gun surprise you." He stood near her, not touching, but she could feel his steady presence. She took a deep breath. She aimed. She thought of Pike. She thought of Calder. She squeezed. The gun fired, and the middle bottle shattered into a spray of glass. She looked at him, her mouth open in surprise. He gave a single, small nod. "You are not bad. You listen." "I was a printer," she said, as if that explained it. "I am good with my hands. I can read ledgers. If I could get into his office, I could find where he sent her. I could find proof." The thought hung in the air, dangerous and sharp. "Calder House is a fortress," Eli said quietly. "His men are at the gate. You saw them at the well." "Not always," June said, a desperate energy rising in her. "There is a market night, this Friday. The whole town goes. Calder will be there. His men will be drinking. They will be careless." Eli looked at her. The anger was gone, replaced by a deep, grim calculation. He had promised to help her until the storm passed. The storm was over, but the real one was just beginning. "It is a fool's errand, Miss Hale." "It is the only one I have," she replied. He looked at the darkening hills, the land that Calder thought he owned. He looked at the mended shirt he was wearing, the stitches smooth against his shoulder. "Friday," he said, "we will go. We will look. Nothing more." The 2 days that followed were a new kind of quiet. It was not the silence of the storm, which had been a heavy, suffocating blanket. This was a silence that vibrated, like a plucked string. They had made a pact, and the air in the stone house was charged with it. Friday loomed. Eli was a practical man. If she was to go with him, she would not be a liability. He took her out to the rocky arroyos behind the cottonwoods, places where the land was broken and treacherous. He saddled his gentlest mare, a steady-eyed buckskin. "You ride like a town woman," he said flatly. It was not an insult, just a fact. You sit on top, you must sit in. Feel her move. She knows this ground better than you do. He taught her to shift her weight, to trust the horse's feet, to keep her heels down and her eyes up. She listened. She was clumsy at first, her knuckles white on the reins. But she did not complain. She fell once, landing hard in the gravel, knocking the wind from her lungs. He was off his own horse before she hit the ground. He reached for her, his hand stopping just short of her arm. "Are you hurt?" She gasped, pulling in a ragged breath. No, she was bruised, but she was not broken. She got to her feet, waving him off, and pulled herself back into the saddle. He watched her, and the smallest flicker of respect entered his eyes. That evening, the roles reversed. She sat with him at the kitchen table, his own ranch ledger open between them. It was simple, just numbers for feed, cattle, and wire. "This is clean," she said. "Your numbers are clear." She took a piece of charcoal and a sheet of brown wrapping paper. "Calder's ledgers will not be. Men like him, they use the page to hide things. They will make the columns small, the print tiny. They will run the numbers together, hoping you do not see the entry for recruitment or transport hidden inside the column for freight." She showed him how to read the fine print, how to look for the inconsistencies. He was a man who could read a trail in the dark, but he squinted at the small numbers, his brow furrowed in concentration. She was showing him a different kind of tracking, one he had never known. On Thursday, the day before the market, he was mending a section of fence near the creek. It was new wire, sharp and cruel. A strand snapped free under tension, lashing back, and laid his forearm open from wrist to elbow. He came back to the house near dusk, walking in without a word, blood dripping steadily onto the stone floor. June gasped. She ran for the clean water and the rags. Sit down now." He sat at the table, his face pale beneath his dark skin, while she washed the wound. It was deep, a wicked gash that would need stitches. "I cannot stitch," she said, her voice tight with panic. "It will not need it," he said, his voice strained. "Just wrap it, tightly." Her hands, the hands of a printer, were deft and gentle. She cleaned the wound, applied a layer of strong-smelling salve from his medicine tin, and began to wrap the clean cotton bandage. His arm was roped with muscle, the skin scarred from older battles. Her fingers brushed his skin, and the contact was electric. It was the first time they had touched for more than a second. He looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable. She was bent over his arm, her brow furrowed, her focus absolute. She was not weak. He saw that now. She finished the knot, and her hands lingered for a moment on his arm, steadying the bandage. He could feel the warmth of her palms. He looked up, and she looked up at the same time. Their faces were inches apart. The air was thick with the smell of the salve, the coffee on the stove, and something else, something unnamed. He pulled his arm back, his voice gruff. "It is good. Thank you." She stood up quickly, gathering the bloody rags. "You were careless." "Yes," he said, and he was not just talking about the wire. That afternoon, they went to town for supplies. The air had changed. When they stepped onto the boardwalk of the Mercantile, the usual chatter stopped. Reverend Pike was standing outside the church, speaking to two women. He saw June and Eli, and he deliberately turned his back on them, a public, damning gesture. The women with him stared, their faces pinched with disapproval, and they whispered behind their hands. The words were quiet, but they carried, "Soiled dove, living with him, no shame." June felt her face burn, but she kept her chin high and walked into the store. Eli followed, his presence a solid wall behind her. Inside, a man and woman were buying flour. They looked worn, their clothes patched but clean. The man, Jed, saw Eli and nodded. "Eli." His wife, Nora, a small, tired woman with kind eyes, looked at June. She had heard the rumors, but she looked at June's face and then at Eli's. She offered June a small, tight smile. "Ma'am." It was a small act, but it was a defiance. Jed and Nora ran a small homestead in the next valley, and they were, June realized, in the same boat as Eli, small ranchers being squeezed by Calder, people who knew what a real threat looked like. They did not trust the whispers of a comfortable, well-fed preacher. The night of the market, Eli's house was still. "Are you certain?" he asked one last time. "She is in his house. Mr. Redhawk, I am going." "Eli?" he said. She looked at him. "What?" "My name. It is Eli." He would not go to the town. The market would be full of light and noise. A perfect distraction. Calder House was on a hill overlooking the town, a dark fortress. They would approach it from the desert, from the high, dark side. He moved like a ghost. He was part of the darkness, his feet making no sound on the stones. June followed, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. She tried to move as he had taught her, to place her feet with care, to listen to the night. They reached the high adobe wall of the compound. The main gate was lit by torches, and men were riding out, laughing, heading for the drinks and games in town. The house itself, however, was quiet. Eli led her along the wall, to a place where the shadows were deepest. A massive, overgrown rose garden pressed against the side of the house. A strange, decadent touch of the East. The thorns were thick, but they provided perfect cover. They slipped inside, crouching low. They were just below the main windows of the house. One was open to the warm night air. A lantern cast a yellow square of light onto the roses. They heard voices. Calder's was a deep, confident rumble. The other was Reverend Pike's, oily and ingratiating. "The railroad board approved it this morning." Calder was saying, "The new station stop will be built at the south pasture, exactly as we planned. It will bypass Dust Creek entirely." A masterful stroke. "Colonel," Pike said, "and the inventory." "The new girls arriving on the 10 o'clock train." June's blood went cold. "They will be processed at the new station. Not in town. No fuss. Mr. Slocum will handle the manifests." Calder's voice was casual, as if discussing cattle. "The decent ones, the ones who can read, will be assigned to the households as contract wives. The rougher ones, the railroad crews always need laundry women and entertainment." "A fine plan," Pike said. "A truly Christian endeavor, saving these poor women from the squalor of the cities." June dug her fingernails into her palms to keep from screaming. Contract wives. This was not a marriage agency. It was a supply chain. She had to see. She crept closer, ignoring Eli's sharp hiss. She moved under the window, pressing herself against the adobe. There was another window. Lower down, half buried in the earth, it was grated. A basement. It was dark, but a sliver of light from Calder's office above caught something. June's breath hitched. Tied to one of the thick iron bars, catching the faint light, was a small, torn strip of blue silk. It was faded, dirty, but it was the exact color, the exact material, as the scarf wrapped around her own wrist. "Maddie?" "She was here. She was down there in that darkness." A gasp, small and choked, escaped her. She lunged forward, her hand outstretched, trying to touch the ribbon. A deep woof split the night. then a roar, a hound, then another. Lights flared inside the house. A chair scraped. "Who is out there?" Calder bellowed. Eli grabbed her, his arm like an iron bar around her waist. "Now." They burst from the rose garden, thorns tearing at their clothes. A door slammed open. Men were shouting. The dogs were loose, barking, crashing through the brush. "This way," Eli yelled. He did not run toward the gate. He ran toward the back of the property, toward the empty darkness of the fields. He half dragged, half carried her. They reached a barbed wire fence. Eli threw his bandaged arm over the top wire, ignoring the pain, and vaulted it. He turned, grabbed June, and threw her over as if she weighed nothing. The dogs were at the fence, baying, frantic. Men were running from the bunkhouse, carrying lanterns. Eli saw the dark, slick line of the main irrigation ditch ahead, the one that watered Calder's vast fields. It was 10 feet wide and steep-banked. "Hold your breath," he ordered. He did not wait for an answer. He pulled her against him, wrapped his good arm around her, and jumped. The water was black and shockingly cold. They hit the muddy bottom and surfaced, gasping under the dark cover of the far bank. He held her head above the water, pressing them both into the slick, foul-smelling mud, hidden by the overhang of the bank. The lanterns and the dogs ran past them, following the fence line. The shouting faded as they spread out, searching the wrong way. They waited, shivering, the cold water seeping into their bones. 5 minutes. 10. "We have to move," he whispered, his mouth next to her ear. They climbed the muddy bank, soaked and covered in filth. He led them, low and fast, away from the ranch, into a wide, skeletal field of yucca plants. Their sharp, spiked leaves were a better defense than any fence. They hid there, shivering, until the moon was high and the last of the lights at Calder House went out. The walk back to Cottonwood Ranch was 2 miles. They were exhausted, frozen, and caked in drying mud. "She is there," June said, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely speak. "I saw the ribbon. Eli, she is in that basement, right under him." "I heard," he said. His voice was grim, stripped of all its calm. "We have proof," she said, grabbing his arm. "We heard them. Calder, Pike, the contract wives, the train. We go to Sheriff Gray. Now." Eli stopped walking. He looked at her in the pale moonlight, his face a hard mask. "We have nothing," he said, his voice as cold as the ditch water. "We have what 2 trespassers heard in the dark. We have a piece of ribbon on a bar. It is our word against Calder and the town preacher. What do you think the sheriff can do with that, he will ask them. They will deny it, and by morning, Maddie will be gone." June's hope collapsed. He was right. "So what do we do?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "We do nothing. We just let them put her on that train." He looked at the lights of Dust Creek, far below them. He looked at his hand, where his bandage was soaked with mud and fresh blood. He had crossed a line tonight, jumping into that ditch. He had hidden from dogs on land that was not his. He had trespassed. He had run. The peace he had built his life on was a memory. "I did not say that," he said, his voice quiet and more dangerous than she had ever heard it. "I said we do not have proof for the law. We are on our own." They reached the stone house just before dawn, soaked in the cold, black mud of the irrigation ditch. They were shivering, exhausted, and defeated. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the knowledge of what they had seen: the blue ribbon, a small flag of despair tied to an iron bar. Eli barred the door. He looked at the mud they were tracking onto his clean floor. He went to the stove and lit it, his movement stiff. The cut on his arm, the one from the wire, was bleeding again, a dark stain of red mixing with the black mud. "You must clean that," June said, her voice hollow. "We need proof," he said, ignoring her, speaking to the new flame in the stove. He was right. "We have nothing. Just a story about a ribbon." "The manifests," June said, her mind clicking. The printer's apprentice surfacing through the fear. At the market. You said Calder and Pike mentioned a 10 o'clock train. They said Slocum would handle the manifests. That is the proof. Slocum will not give it to you, Eli said. He finally looked at his arm, then went to the sink to pump water over the wound. He will not have to give it to me, June said. She was shaking, but not just from the cold. She was angry. He is the postmaster, but he is also the railroad freight agent. He keeps 2 sets of books. I know he does. I saw the railroad ledger when I was looking for Maddie's mail. It was on a separate desk. She would not wait. She cleaned the mud from her dress as best she could, put on her driest clothes, and took the mare. She rode to town alone in the bright, unforgiving morning light, leaving Eli at the ranch. She knew he needed to guard the property, but she also knew this was her part of the fight. She walked into the mercantile. Slocum was behind the counter, sorting parcels. He saw her and his face went pale. He had heard about the disturbance at Calder House. The whole town was buzzing with it. How the dogs had been raised. Miss Hale, he stammered. I cannot help you. I am not here for help. Mr. Slocum, she said, her voice as cold and clear as the well water at Cottonwood. I am here for the freight manifest for the 10 o'clock train, the one arriving tonight. I cannot, that is private railroad business, he squeaked. June walked past him. She went behind the counter, past the postal scales, to the small, dusty desk in the back where the railroad ledger sat. It was open. Slocum was clearly expecting a delivery. You cannot be back here, he cried. Following her. Her eyes scanned the columns, her printer's training making quick work of the cramped script, dry goods, lumber, feed, and then, at the bottom, a separate entry, coded HH, 12 units, destination CH. 8H, she murmured. She saw a smaller invoice book tucked under the ledger. She opened it. It was a receipt book. The top copy was a bill. To Colonel S. Calder, for transport of 1212 units, household hospitality service, from St. Louis Agency. The charge was $144. It was not her invoice, but it was her invoice. It was the system, and tucked into the back of the book, missed by Slocum, was a carbon copy of an older order, from 7 months ago. Transport of 11 unit, governess service, name M. Hale. The proof, it was here, in her hands, on thin, flimsy paper. She tore the old carbon copy from the book. You cannot do that, Slocum shrieked, grabbing for it. June shoved the paper into the bodice of her dress. You tell Colonel Calder I have it. You tell him I know about the train tonight, and you tell him I know he is partners with Reverend Pike. You tell him. She walked out of the store, leaving Slocum sputtering, his face the color of ash. When she got back to the ranch, Eli was waiting on the porch. He had seen the way she rode in, fast and reckless. She pulled the crumpled paper from her dress and handed it to him. He read it. His face, which had been tight with anger and worry, went very still. M. Hale, he read aloud. Governess service. It is a slave contract. Eli, she whispered. That is what he is running. That is what Pike is doing. They are importing women, and Maddie was one of them. Before he could answer, a rider appeared on the trail. It was one of Jed's sons, kicking his mule hard. He carried a piece of paper. He handed it to Eli. From the Colonel, Mr. Redhawk. He said to give you this. It was a heavy, cream-colored card. An invitation. Colonel Silas Calder requests the honor of your presence at the annual Cattlemen's Ball. Tonight, Calder House. At the bottom, scrawled in black ink, were 2 names, Elijah Redhawk and guest. June felt sick. It is a trap. He knows I have the paper. He wants us there. He wants to kill us. Eli looked at the card. He looked at the dust on the trail. He looked at June, at the mud still caked on the hem of her dress. No, he said quietly. It is not a trap. It is a command, and it is a test. We cannot go. We must go, Eli said. He folded the invitation. The whole town will be there. He is daring us. He wants to see if we will hide. He wants the town to see us hide. They are already calling you my whore. They are calling me a half-breed fool. If we hide, we prove them right." He looked her straight in the eye. "We will not hide. We will wash our faces, and we will walk into his house as my guest." She had only one dress that was not stained with mud or blood. She washed it in the creek and hung it in the hot, dry wind. It was a plain, gray cotton, but it was clean. She braided her hair tightly, wrapping the blue scarf around the base of the braid. Eli shaved. A rare act. He put on a clean shirt, the one she had mended. He rebandaged his arm. They were not dressing for a party. They were putting on armor. The air was wrong. As the sun began to set, the wind did not cool. It grew hotter. It was a dry, searing wind from the desert, one that smelled of dust and cured dead grass. It snapped the cottonwood leaves and made the horses nervous in the barn. "Fire weather," Eli muttered, looking at the sky. It was a brassy, angry yellow. Calder House was blazing with light. Torches lit the drive, and a fiddler was playing in the massive, open-air barn, which had been cleared for dancing. The entire town was there. This was Calder's show of power. When Eli and June walked in, the fiddle music scratched to a halt. Every eye turned. The whispers were a physical wave of sound. Colonel Calder stood on a raised platform, a drink in his hand. He watched them, a small, amused smile on his face. He nodded, as if they were his honored guests. Reverend Pike was by the punch bowl, his face mottled with rage. Eli did not hesitate. He kept his hand on the small of June's back, a gesture of clear, public possession and protection. He ignored the stares. He walked them straight through the crowd to where Jed and Nora stood by a hay bale. Nora saw them coming. Her face was tight with worry. She looked at Jed, who squared his shoulders. When Eli and June stopped, Nora deliberately offered June a cup of cider. "Miss Hale," she said, her voice loud enough to carry, "it is good to see you this evening." It was a declaration. The barn was split. On one side, Pike and his whispering women. On the other, the few small ranchers who knew Calder's boot on their necks. The fiddler, taking his cue from Calder, struck up a lively tune. "He is watching us," June whispered. "I know," Eli said. "That is why we are here." He held out his hand. "May I have this dance, Miss Hale?" She looked at his hand, then at his face. He was terrified. He was a man of solitude, and he was in the center of the lion's den, inviting them all to look, but he was doing it for her. "Yes," she said. She took his hand. He led her to the floor. They were clumsy. He was a rancher, not a dancer, and his arm was stiff. She was a printer, and she followed his lead as best she could. But they were dancing. They were in the light, and they were not ashamed. They finished the dance to a spatter of polite, confused applause. As they walked off the floor, Reverend Pike stepped into their path. His face was slick with sweat and piety. "A touching display, Miss Hale," he boomed, so that everyone could hear. "It seems you have found a new patron. Are you practicing your wiles on this poor, misguided man now?" The crowd went silent. June felt Eli's hand tense on her arm. She put her own hand over his, a silent plea for calm. She turned to the Reverend. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear, and it cut through the silence. "Reverend," she said, her gaze steady, "I have been in your town for less than a week. In that time, you have stalked me, you have slandered me, and you have prayed at me. I thought you were a man of God, but you seem far more interested in gossip and contracts than in souls. Perhaps you should pray for your own—" A collective gasp went through the crowd. Nora put her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with shocked delight. Pike turned a deep, furious shade of purple. He raised his hand as if to strike her or curse her. "Reverend," Eli's voice was soft, but it stopped the man cold. "You are upsetting my guest." Eli guided June away from the center of the floor. toward the cool air of the porch. They stepped outside, the hot, dry wind hitting their faces. "You have made an enemy of him for good," Eli said. "He was already my enemy," she said, breathing hard. "That was a fine scarf you were wearing." The voice came from the shadows. It was Jace, the man from the well. He was drunk, and he was not alone. 3 other Calder hands were with him. Jace lunged, fast and mean. He did not go for her. He went for the scarf. He grabbed the blue silk wrapped in her braid and yanked. June cried out as her head snapped back. Eli moved. He did not draw his pistol. His hatred of violence was overcome by a cold, precise rage. He grabbed Jace's wrist, the one tangled in the scarf, with his left hand. He squeezed. June heard a bone pop. The man screamed. With his right hand, his bandaged hand, Eli reached up, grabbed the heavy oil lantern hanging from the porch rafter, and tore it from its hook. He smashed it onto the wooden planks at Jace's feet. Glass, oil, and flame exploded everywhere. "You will let go of her," Eli said. His voice was a low growl. The men backed away, terrified of the fire and the look in Eli's eyes. Jace, whimpering, untangled his fingers and scrambled back. The porch door opened. Sheriff Amos Gray stood there, his hand on his gun. Trouble. Eli. Eli kicked the burning lantern off the porch into the dirt, where it sputtered out. He smoothed his shirt. His voice was perfectly calm. "No trouble. Sheriff, it seems a lantern slipped. It was an accident." He held out his arm to June, who was shaking, her hand holding her torn scarf. They walked back inside, past the sheriff, past the stunned crowd. Colonel Calder was waiting for them by the main door. He was no longer smiling. "A lively performance. Miss Hale," he whispered, his voice a venomous hiss. "But you are running out of partners. You do not seem to understand. You belong to me. The contract is clear." June looked him in the eye. She reached into her bodice and pulled out the crumpled, flimsy piece of paper, the carbon copy, M. Hale. She did not throw it. She did not raise her voice. She unfolded it and held it up, 6 inches from his face. "Is this part of the contract, Colonel?" she asked, her voice shaking but full of ice. "The one that lists my sister as freight, the one that proves you are a slaver, and your preacher is a liar." Calder's face went white. He looked from the paper to her, and his eyes were no longer amused. They were the eyes of a snake. He knew, in that instant, that she had the one thing that could ruin him. June turned, took Eli's arm, and they walked out of the barn. The ride back to Cottonwood Ranch was silent. The hot, strange wind buffeted them, carrying the smell of dry pine and cured grass. They knew they had declared war. They reached the stone house. The air was thick and hard to breathe. Eli did not light the main lantern. He knelt by the hearth, lifted a loose stone, and pulled out a small, heavy iron lockbox. He used a key from his pocket to open it. Inside was a small stack of coins, a folded paper, and a silver locket. He took out the deed to the ranch and the stack of coins. He stood up. He went to the kitchen and took the key to the pantry, the key to all their food. He pressed the keys and the folded deed into June's hand. "What is this?" she whispered. "My father's locket," he said, closing her fingers over the items. "The deed, and all the cash I have. It is about $40. If I fall, if something happens to me tonight, you will not be helpless. The pantry is full. The deed is yours. You will have a way out. You will be safe." June stared at the items in her palm. This was everything. This was his entire life. It was a trust so profound it hurt to breathe. "Eli," she started. He put a finger to his lips. He was looking at the window. "Smell that." She sniffed. It was not just the hot grass. It was smoke, wood smoke, a lot of it. Eli moved to the window and looked north, toward the high ridge that formed the boundary of his property. The sky, which had been black, now had a faint, sick orange glow. "Fire," he said, his voice flat and dead. He has set a fire on the north ridge." "The wind," June said, her heart stopping. "It will carry it right here. To the house, to the cottonwoods." "No," Eli said, grabbing his rifle from the wall. "It is not for the house. Not yet. It is a diversion. He knows I have to fight it, to save the grazing land. He is pulling me away from the ranch." He looked at her, his eyes dark with a terrible knowledge. "He is pulling me away from you. He is coming for that paper. And he is coming for you." The fire was a living thing on the north ridge. The hot, dry wind was its breath, and it was inhaling Eli's grazing land. He did not hesitate. He moved to the small cabinet where he kept his affairs. Pulling out the iron lockbox June had seen him use, he pressed the keys and the folded deed back into her hand. "Eli, no," she said, her voice tight. "I am not leaving you." "You are not listening," he said, his voice sharp, not with anger, but with a terrible urgency. He grabbed 2 rifles from the rack. "He is splitting his forces. The fire is to draw me out. The second group is coming here. For you, and for that paper." He shoved one of the rifles, a lighter Winchester, into her hands. "Bar the door behind me. Do not open it for any sound you hear. Not for shouting, not for shooting, only for my voice. Do you understand? You cannot fight a wildfire alone," she cried, clutching the rifle. "I am not fighting the fire," he said, his face a mask of grim determination. "I am hunting the men who set it." He was already at the door, grabbing 2 wet sacks from the water barrel. "They will come for me," she said, her mind racing. "If you leave, I am trapped here. If they come, I am alone. I am going with you." The paper, she tapped the bodice of her dress. "Where the flimsy carbon copy was still hidden goes where I go. You want to hunt them? Let us hunt them together." He looked at her, this small, fierce woman in her ruined party dress, holding a rifle she barely knew how to use. He saw the iron in her spine. He did not have time to argue. He gave a sharp, definitive nod. "Stay on the horse. Do not get off, for any reason." They ran to the barn, saddling his horse and the buckskin mare in a frantic, silent rush. They rode out of the cottonwood grove and the heat hit them like a physical blow. The north ridge was a roaring, solid wall of orange. The wind was a demon, carrying hot ash and burning leaves that rained down on them like a hellish snow. The air was thick and tasted of soot. As they neared the blaze, they could hear the roar, a sound like a constant, angry ocean. The fire was moving faster than a man could run. "He is pushing it south," Eli yelled over the sound, "toward the creek. He is trying to trap our stock." He spurred his horse, and June followed, her eyes streaming from the smoke, the blue scarf tied over her nose and mouth. They galloped through the shimmering heat, and then June saw them. Through the smoke, other figures, a wagon, a woman, and 2 small children, huddled by a frantic-looking man. "It is Jed," Eli shouted. "Jed and Nora. The fire has jumped to their land." They rode up, their horses dancing, terrified of the heat. Jed was beating at a line of fire with a wet blanket, a hopeless gesture. Nora was trying to get her 2 small children, a boy and a girl, into the wagon, but the mules were rearing in panic. "Eli! Thank God," Jed yelled, his face black with soot. It came so fast. "Where are your horses?" Eli yelled. "In the small paddock by the tool shed. I cannot get to them." The wind shifted, a violent, hot gust. A sheet of flame detached itself from the main fire and leaped across the dry grass, landing between the family and the tool shed, cutting them off. The mules, blind with terror, snapped their harnesses and bolted into the darkness. Nora screamed. Her children were on the far side of the new blaze, trapped against the tool shed wall. "I will get the stock," Eli bellowed at June. "Get Nora and Jed to the creek bed. It is the only safe ground. Go." He wheeled his horse, pulling his wet sack tight over his own face, and plunged straight through the smoke toward the paddock. June jumped from her mare. She grabbed Nora. "The creek," Eli said, "the creek." "My babies," Nora shrieked, trying to run toward the flames. Jed grabbed his wife.
I will go. I will get them.
No, June screamed. She looked at the wall of flame. She looked at the high, rocky ridge that overlooked the paddock, and she saw it, a single, bright flash of reflected light, not firelight, moonlight on metal. It was an ambush. The fire was the trap, and they were the bait. "Eli," she screamed, her voice tearing in the smoke. A single, sharp crack echoed through the canyon, distinct from the roar of the fire. Eli was at the paddock gate, hauling it open. He did not fall, but he spun, grabbing his shoulder, a look of profound shock on his face. He stumbled, catching himself on the fence post. He had been hit. "Sniper," June yelled, pointing at the ridge.
"Jed, get Eli. He is hit."
Another shot. The bullet struck the fence post where Eli's head had been a second before, sending splinters flying. Eli was down, trying to crawl, as the freed horses stampeded past him. June raised the Winchester. She aimed at the flash on the ridge and pulled the trigger. The kick nearly knocked her over, the shot wild, but it was enough. The sniper, surprised by return fire, ducked behind his rock. "Nora, run to the creek," June yelled. She looked around, frantic. She saw the sniper's horse, tethered to a tree 30 yards away, hidden from the fire. He had been waiting for them. She did not think. She ran, her legs pumping, the smoke burning her lungs. The sniper saw her. He fired. The bullet whined past her ear. She kept running. She reached the horse, a big roan. She grabbed her dagger from her boot and slashed the reins. She hauled herself onto its bare back. Grabbing a handful of mane, she kicked the horse, wheeling it around, and galloped back into the inferno. Eli was on his feet, leaning against the fence, his rifle at his side. He was bleeding. "Get on," she shrieked, pulling the horse up hard. "June, the children," he gasped, his face pale. "Jed has them, get on." He tried to pull himself up, his left arm useless. He could not make it. The sniper fired again. The horse screamed, rearing. June grabbed Eli's good arm and pulled, using the horse's motion, hauling him up behind her. He was a dead weight, but he was on. "Hold on," she screamed. She kicked the roan, not back toward the creek, not toward the house, but away, away from the fire, away from the sniper. She rode them deep into the rocky canyons, the roar of the flames and the shouts of Jed and Nora fading behind them, until the only sound was the horse's ragged breathing and the wind. She rode for nearly an hour, until the horse was stumbling with exhaustion and Eli was a heavy, cold weight against her back. She found what she was looking for, a small, dark shape against a cliff face, an old, abandoned line shack, built of stone, used by sheep herders in the winter. She slid from the horse, her legs buckling. Eli fell more than dismounted, collapsing onto the dirt. She dragged him inside, into the pitch-black, musty-smelling shelter. She pulled the horse into the lean-to beside it. Then she went back and barred the heavy wooden door. They were safe, but they were trapped. The tiny room was suffocating. The wind howled outside, pressing smoke through the cracks in the stone. June fumbled in her pocket, her hands shaking, and found a match. She lit a single, grimy lantern on a small table. Eli was on the floor, his back against the wall. His face was gray. His shirt was soaked in blood. "He hit you," she whispered, the word stupid and obvious. "He just grazed me," Eli breathed, his teeth chattering. "It is cold." June ripped his shirt open. The bullet had torn a long, deep furrow across his collarbone and shoulder. It was not a mortal wound, but it was ugly, and it was bleeding badly. "It is not a graze, Eli. It needs stitches." She looked around. There was a rusted stove, a broken chair, and a single, filthy horse blanket on the cot, in a saddlebag on the floor, left by the last rider. She found a small tin, inside a curved needle, some gut thread, and a half-empty flask of whiskey. "This will hurt," she said, her voice shaking. She poured the whiskey over the wound. Eli hissed, his whole body going rigid, but he did not make a sound. "Drink the rest," she said. He shook his head. "You drink it. Your hands are shaking." She took a swallow. The liquor burned a line down her throat, but it steadied her. She threaded the needle, her printer's hands finding their old, deft skill. "Hold still." She pushed the needle into his skin. He watched her, his dark eyes fixed on her face, tracking her every movement in the flickering lantern light. He did not flinch. She worked in a grim, focused silence. The only sounds the whistle of the wind and the small, wet pull of the thread. When she was done, she tied off the knot and sat back on her heels. They were both covered in ash, sweat, and his blood. They were shaking. The adrenaline was gone, and the high desert cold was seeping into their wet clothes. "It is so cold," he said again. She grabbed the one-horse blanket from the cot. It was rough, oily wool, but it was thick. She draped it over his shoulders. He was shivering violently. "You, too," he whispered, his teeth chattering. "Get under it. You will freeze before morning." She hesitated. This was a line she had not known existed.
"Juniper,"
he said, his voice raw.
"it is not a request. I cannot keep warm alone."
She slid under the heavy wool, sitting beside him, her back against the cold stone. It was not enough. The cold was a living thing. He turned toward her, wincing as his new stitches pulled. He put his good arm around her and pulled her tight against his chest. They were face to face, wrapped in one blanket, their knees touching, sharing the small, desperate pocket of warmth. She could feel his heart beating, strong but strained. She could feel the shivers racking his body. "I thought he had killed you," she whispered, her face pressed against his collarbone. "When I saw you spin, I thought I was alone again." He held her tighter, his hand gripping her shoulder. He missed. His voice was a rough murmur against her hair. "When I saw Jace pull your scarf at the party, I wanted to kill him. I have not felt that fire in 10 years. They were quiet, listening to the wind screaming outside. It was a suffocating, terrible sound, but inside the small stone room, there was this bubble of stillness, of warmth. He was a lonely man. His bed was lonely. His ranch was lonely. He had built a life of solitude, and she had smashed it open, bringing fire and bullets and chaos, and now she was in his arms, shaking. He moved his good hand, lifting it to her face. His fingers were rough, calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He traced the line of her jaw, his thumb brushing the ash from her cheek. "You are shaking," he said. "So are you," she whispered, looking up at him. His eyes were dark, and for the first time, she saw past the calm, past the iron. She saw the man, tired and hurt and afraid. He leaned in, slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of survival. It was a kiss that tasted of soot and whiskey and salt. It was a desperate human promise in the middle of a firestorm. It was an anchor. It deepened. The fear, the exhaustion, the terror of the last few days. It all melted into this one solid, grounding act. This was a choice. This was the consensus. It was a shared acknowledgement that they had faced death and chosen each other. She put her hands on his chest, feeling the warmth of him. He kissed her forehead, her eyelids, her cheek, as if memorizing her. "From this night," he murmured, his voice thick, "you are not alone. I will not let you be alone." He held her as she cried, silent tears of exhaustion and relief that tracked clean lines through the grime on her face. The fire in his lonely life had been set, a slow, healing burn against the cold terror. They held each other, a silent promise of tenderness, a commitment made not in a church, but in a stone shed on a night of fire. Later, in the deepest part of the night, the wind finally died. The fire had passed them by. They lay wrapped together under the wool blanket, the exhaustion so deep it was almost like peace. He was whispering, his voice low, almost inaudible. It was not English. What she murmured, half asleep. He turned his head, his lips brushing her hair. "It is Yavapai," he said. "It is a name for you, Isa Kap Ate." She was quiet, listening. "It means," he whispered, his voice full of a new, quiet recognition, "she who wears blue." When the dawn came, it was a sickly gray. The sky choked with smoke. The world outside the shed was a blackened, scarred landscape. The fire had burned itself out against the high, rocky ridges. They moved stiffly. The wound on Eli's shoulder was an angry red, but the bleeding had stopped. They were sore, covered in grime, and deeply, profoundly tired. June helped him onto the roan, and she mounted behind him. They rode back to Cottonwood Ranch in silence, picking their way through the charred, smoking remains of the north pasture. The house was standing. The great cottonwood trees, protected by the creek, were untouched, their leaves green against the gray sky. They were home. But as they got closer, Eli tensed. The barn. The main barn door, which they had closed, was wide open. Eli slid from the horse, his rifle in his good hand. June was right behind him. He stepped into the barn. It was a wreck. The stalls were empty. His horse was gone. The buckskin mare was gone. The mule team was gone. It was not just theft. The harnesses had been slashed to ribbons. The bags of grain had been torn open. The contents scattered and fouled. The tack was broken. Calder had made his move. He had pulled Eli out with the fire, tried to have him shot. When that failed, his men had come here. They had not burned the house. They did not want to be blamed for that. They had done something cleaner. Eli looked at the empty stalls, his face a mask of cold, hard realization. "He has pinned us," Eli said, his voice flat. "He has taken our horses. He has taken our way out. He knows the 10 o'clock train is tonight, and he knows now that we have no way to stop it." They stood in the ruined silence of the barn for a long time. The smell of fouled grain and slashed leather was the smell of defeat. Eli's good hand was clenched so tight his knuckles were white. "He has pinned us," Eli said again, his voice flat. He looked at his stitched shoulder, at the useless, broken tack, at the 5 miles of rocky trail that separated them from Dust Creek. "The train is at 10 o'clock. We have no way to get there, no way to fight." "Then we walk," June said. She tore a strip of clean cloth from a ruined saddle blanket, went to the pump, and soaked it. She walked back to him and began to clean the fresh blood and grime from his stitches. He winced, but his eyes never left her face. "We walk," she repeated, her voice low and fierce. "We will be caked in dirt and half dead, but we will walk into that town. We will walk into the sheriff's office. You have been shot. Jed and Nora were attacked. That is enough. He has to listen." The walk was an agony. The sun beat down on the smoke-filled valley. Eli was steady for the first mile. His jaw set, but the wound and the exhaustion from the night were too much. By the second mile, he was leaning on her, his breathing harsh. June, small but fueled by a desperate, cold rage, put his good arm over her shoulder and half-dragged him. They looked like refugees from a war when they stumbled onto the main street of Dust Creek. The townspeople stopped and stared. They were covered in soot, dried mud, and blood. Eli, the quiet, formidable rancher, was pale and visibly broken. They went straight to the sheriff's office. Amos Gray was at his desk. He looked up, saw them, and the color drained from his face. "My God, Eli," he said, standing up. "What happened?" "Calder," Eli said, his voice a dry rasp. He sank into a chair. He set the fire on the north ridge. He had a sniper waiting. "He hit me." "He is lying," June said, her voice shaking. "He did not just hit him. He ambushed him, while he was trying to save Nora and Jed's children from the fire." "Jed and Nora," the sheriff asked, his hand going to his gun belt. "They are safe. Their place is gone." Eli said, "We got separated in the smoke. Amos, he is not finished. He sent men to my ranch.
They did not burn it. They crippled me. They took every horse, every mule. They slashed my tech to ribbons.
June stepped forward, her eyes blazing.
He did it, Sheriff, because of this?
She pulled the crumpled, flimsy carbon copy from her bodice and slammed it on his desk. M. Hale, Governess Service. He knows I have it. He knows it proves he is a slaver, and he is moving her. Sheriff, tonight, on the 10 o'clock train, he is moving my sister. Amos Gray looked at the paper. He looked at Eli's wound. He looked at the desperation in June's face. He was a tired man, but he was not a coward. He took a deep breath. "It is not enough," he said softly. What June cried.
"It is not enough. This is paper. His lawyer will tear it apart. His word against yours. I need more."
"Then get more," June said. "Nora and Jed saw it. Slocum knows Reverend Pike is in on it. He wears the ring of the agency that sold her." "All right," the sheriff said, his voice suddenly hard. He grabbed his hat. "All right, miss, we will do this, but we do it my way, by the book. So it sticks." He turned to his deputy, a young man who looked terrified. "Billy, go to the saloon. Go to the Mercantile. You tell every man in this town there is an emergency public hearing at the town hall, right now. You tell them it concerns the fire and the railroad, and you tell Colonel Calder and Reverend Pike that their presence is required." The town hall was just the large, dusty room over the Mercantile, but within 20 minutes, it was full. It was full of ranchers, shopkeepers, and railroad men. Calder was there, flanked by his lawyer, a man in a clean suit from the city. Calder looked impatient, but not worried. Reverend Pike stood near the front, his hands clasped, a look of pious concern on his face. Sheriff Gray stood on the small platform, Eli and June on the bench behind him. Eli sat straight, his face a mask of pain, his ruined shirt visible to everyone. "I have called this meeting," Gray began, his voice booming, "because there was a fire last night, a fire that destroyed Jed and Nora's homestead, a fire that was set by men." The room murmured. "Mr. Redhawk was shot while fighting that fire. His ranch was vandalized, his stock stolen." Calder's lawyer stood up. "Sheriff, this is all speculation. My client is a victim here as well. He lost grazing land. He has offered a reward of $50 for information. This is hardly a matter for a public hearing." "Sit down, Counselor," Gray said. He turned. "Miss Hale, tell them what you told me." June stood up. Her dress was still torn and muddy. She was shaking, but she held the gaze of every person in that room. She told her story. The search for Maddie, the mail order contract, the M at the station, the blue ribbon on the basement bar, the ring on Pike's hand. Pike gasped, a look of theatrical shock on his face. "Lies, slander. This woman is unhinged. She was trespassing on the Colonel's property." "She was," the lawyer agreed, his voice smooth, but she did not stop there. He turned to the crowd. "This woman, this Juniper Hale, she arrived here under false pretenses, lying to Mr. Redhawk, claiming to be a schoolteacher." June flushed, the truth stinging. "And since that lie was exposed," the lawyer continued, his voice dripping with scorn, "she has been living, has she not, in this man's house, alone, unmarried, for almost a week. We all saw her at the dance last night, in his arms, bold as brass. What good citizen's testimony are we listening to here? Or is this the desperate, jealous fantasy of a common camp follower?" The room went dead silent. The women in the crowd, who had looked at June with sympathy, now turned their eyes away. She was ruined. Her testimony was dirt. She looked at the floor, tears of shame and fury burning her eyes. Then Eli stood up. The movement was slow, agonizing. He walked from the platform to stand directly beside her. He was covered in soot, his shirt stained with blood. He looked like a man who had walked through hell, but his voice was perfectly clear. "You are right, Counselor," he said, his voice quiet. Yet it filled the room. She is not a schoolteacher, and she is not a mail-order bride.
The lawyer smiled, a shark smile. Then she is a liar.
She is my partner, Eli said.
The smile vanished. The entire town held its breath.
She has been living at my ranch, Eli continued, his voice steady, because I offered her shelter from the man who bought her, and as of last night, when I gave her the deed to my land, she became my full and equal partner in the Cottonwood Ranch. He put his good arm on her shoulder. You are not addressing a camp follower. You are addressing a landowner. You are addressing my partner. And she is accusing your client and that preacher of being slavers. And I'm accusing them of trying to murder me. Nora stood up in the back, her voice shaking. They are telling the truth. We saw the fire. We heard the shot. My children. They were trapped. Eli and Miss Hale saved them. The room was turning. The sheer, raw truth of Eli's stand, his public declaration, had shifted the ground under their feet. Calder was not rattled. He stood up, clapping his hands slowly, a look of amused pity on his face. A touching speech. Red Hawk, truly noble. You would give away your land for this. Woman touching. But it changes nothing. He looked at the sheriff. This is a waste of time. My lawyer is right. You have no proof. You have the word of a bitter woman and a half-breed rancher who I have been trying to buy out for a year. He turned to the crowd, his voice booming with confidence. Yes, I am bringing in new workers. This territory is growing. It needs labor. 12 new household workers are arriving on the 10 o'clock train tonight. They are being processed at the depot and sent on to Silver City. It is all perfectly legal, all contracted. He looked directly at June, and his eyes were full of triumphant malice. And yes, a Miss M. Hale is among them. She was found unsuitable for her original position and is being transferred. The railroad has a schedule to keep. June's heart stopped. Tonight, she whispered. You are moving her tonight. At 10 o'clock, Calder said. He smiled. In less than 4 hours, and seeing as my neighbor Mr. Red Hawk has no horses, I trust he will not be interfering with railroad business. He had won. He had admitted it, shielded by the law, and he had thrown their helplessness in their faces. Sheriff Gray was trapped. Colonel, I must ask you to hold that transfer. On what grounds? Sheriff the lawyer snapped. A stray bullet in the dark. The fantasies of a compromised woman. You stop that interstate train, and I will have federal marshals here by dawn to arrest you. Gray was beaten. He had no authority. The meeting fell apart. Calder and his lawyer walked out, followed by a pale, sweating Reverend Pike. Eli, June, and the sheriff were left in the room. Jed and Nora came up to them, their faces grim. He is taking her, June said, her voice dead. He is taking her, and we cannot stop him. We are not stopping, Eli said. He looked at Jed. He burned you out. He did, Jed said, his voice a low growl. And he threatened my family. Sheriff Eli asked. Amos Gray paced the room, his face dark with fury. Officially, my hands are tied. I cannot stop that train. I cannot enter that yard without cause. I am not asking you to, Sheriff, Eli said, his voice quiet. I am asking you, as a man, to back my play, unofficially. Gray stopped pacing. He looked at Eli. He nodded once. What is the plan? He expects me to come in shooting. He expects me to try and free the women, Eli said. But he is wrong. Eli, what are you saying? June cried. We have to free them. We will, he said. He looked at her. But we are not going to fight 24 men. We are going to steal them. Jed, Nora, you have your wagon, the one the children were in. We do, Nora said. The mules ran, but they came back. Good, Eli said. He turned to June. He is moving them as freight. Household hospitality. They will not be in a passenger car. They will be in a boxcar. Calder's men will be watching the depot. The front. We will go from the back, June finished, her mind catching the freight yard. Exactly. Jed, Nora, I need a diversion. A big one. At the main crossing, just as the train is pulling in." "We can do that," Jed said, a grim light in his eyes. "Sheriff, I need you to handle Calder. Keep him busy. Keep him in the saloon, where he thinks he has won." "I can do that," Gray said. "And us?" June asked. Eli looked at her. He put his good hand on her arm. "You and I, we are going to stop that train. You are the only one who knows the manifests. You are the only one she will trust. You are the key." The freight yard was dark, lit only by a few lanterns and the hazy, smoke-filled moonlight. It was 15 minutes to 10. Calder's men were everywhere. They were on the roof of the depot, on the water tower. They were not hiding. It was an occupation. Eli and June moved through the shadows, two ghosts in a field of iron. Eli's shoulder was a blaze of pain, but he moved with his old, silent grace. Then June saw a new figure, Reverend Pike. He was not at the depot. He was walking up and down the main track, his head bowed as if in prayer. "He is the lookout," Eli whispered, pulling June behind a stack of barrels. "He is not praying. He is counting heads. He is signaling them." A long, mournful whistle cut the night. The ground began to vibrate. Far down the track, a single, bright eye appeared. It grew, blindingly bright. The chuffing of the steam engine became a roar. The scream of metal brakes, the clanging of the bell. The 10 o'clock train was here. It was a black, iron monster, hissing steam and smoke, shaking the earth as it rolled to a stop. The noise was deafening. This was the moment. As if on cue, they heard shouting from the main crossing, half a mile down. A woman scream, Jed and Nora. Half of Calder's men, startled, ran toward the noise. "Now," Eli said. They slipped from the shadows. They ignored the passenger cars. They ran low and fast, on the dark side of the train, the side away from the depot. Eli had his rifle in his good hand. June had her dagger. They passed the coal tender, the cattle cars. "It is the last one," June whispered, pointing. It was a heavy, windowless boxcar. The doors were sealed, bolted from the outside. June ran to it, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. She pounded on the thick wood with her fists. "Maddie Hale, are you in there?" There was no answer, only the roar of the engine's steam. "Maddie," she screamed again, her voice breaking. Then, from inside, she heard a muffled sound, a sob, a faint, terrified voice. "Sister June, is that you? Help us, please. Oh, God, help us." It was her. Maddie was alive. She was in there. The heavy bolt on the boxcar was thick, unforgiving iron. June beat her fists against it, her knuckles raw. "Maddie, hold on, we are here." "Get her away from there," a man shouted. The diversion at the main crossing had pulled most of the guards, but not all of them. 3 men, led by Reverend Pike, were running from the depot, their pistols drawn. "June, the engine." Eli's voice cut through the hiss of the steam. He was perched in the deep shadow of the freight dock, his rifle already at his shoulder. "Stop the train now." She looked at the bolted door, her heart tearing. She looked at Eli. He was giving her an order, a desperate, impossible task. He trusted her. She ran. She sprinted along the dark side of the train, past the tender, toward the massive, breathing engine. Eli opened fire. The first shot was not aimed at a man, but at the lantern hanging over the depot platform. It exploded, plunging their side of the yard into near darkness. "He is on the dock," a man yelled. Eli fired again. A man screamed and grabbed his knee, falling to the gravel. He fired a third time. Another man cried out, his pistol clattering to the ground as he clutched a shattered wrist. Eli's promise to himself held. He was a protector, not a killer. He was shooting to wound, to stop, to save. His discipline was absolute. June reached the engine cab. The engineer, a large man with a face like a shovel, saw her coming. He grabbed a heavy coal shovel, raising it to strike.
"Get off!" he bellowed.
June was small, but she was fast. She did not try to fight him. She ducked under the swing, throwing herself at his legs. He stumbled, roaring in surprise, and fell backward onto the coal pile. June grabbed the first large lever she saw. It was the air brake. With a desperate, sobbing cry, she threw her entire weight onto it. The sound was a violation, a high, metallic shriek that tore the night apart. Sparks, a torrent of them, erupted from every wheel as the brakes locked. The massive train jolted to a violent, shuddering halt, the cars slamming into each other with a sound like thunder. On the depot roof, 2 snipers were thrown from their perches. Reverend Pike, running toward the boxcar, was pitched headfirst into the dirt. The plan had worked. The train was stopped. From the main crossing, the sound of the diversion changed. It was no longer just shouting. It was the rumble of a heavy wagon, the frantic braying of mules. Jed, with Nora beside him, was driving his wagon directly onto the tracks, creating a solid barricade. Colonel Calder, who had been in the depot signing the final manifests, burst onto the platform, his face livid. "What is the meaning of this? Stop them, seize that woman." He saw June in the cab. He saw Eli on the dock. His trap had been sprung. Reverend Pike scrambled to his feet, his face no longer pious, but twisted with a rat-like fury. He had lost his pistol. He ran to the boxcar, his mask gone. "The property!" he shrieked. "Guard the property!" Calder roared at his men. "Kill Red Hawk, kill him!" The remaining guards opened fire on the dock. Eli was pinned, forced to take cover behind a stack of crates. June leaped from the engine, her dagger in her hand. She ran back to the boxcar. Pike was there, fumbling with the heavy bolt. "Get away from her!" June screamed. Pike turned, his eyes wide and mad. He saw her coming and pulled a small derringer from his waistcoat. He aimed it, his hand shaking. "You harlot! You have ruined everything!" Before he could fire, a new voice boomed from the darkness. "Reverend, I believe you have dropped your prayer book." Sheriff Amos Gray stepped out from the end of the depot, his own pistol leveled and steady. Pike froze. "Sheriff, thank God. This woman, she is hysterical. She is trying to steal this private property." "I think not, Reverend," Gray said, walking forward. He nodded to Pike's open coat. "I see you have brought your collection ledger with you." Pike's hand instinctively went to the small, black book tucked in his vest. The book June had seen at the dance. The book of his secret, dirty money. "You are under arrest, Pike," the sheriff said, "for fraud, for conspiracy, and for kidnapping." As Pike gaped, a new, deafening sound erupted. The train lurched, not forward, but backward. A massive, jarring clang echoed as the cars slammed into each other again. Jed was in the cab. He had taken the engineer's place and thrown the massive engine into reverse, sending a wave of panic and chaos through Calder's men. As the gunmen on the roof scrambled to find new positions, Nora appeared from behind the wagon. She held Jed's heavy hunting rifle. She fired once, and a second time, the shots driving the snipers back into the darkness. She and the sheriff moved to the boxcar, their hands on the heavy, bolted bar. Calder saw it all collapsing. His empire, his plan, his control. With a roar of pure rage, he ran from the platform, shoved the sheriff aside, and tore the heavy bar from the boxcar door himself. He would not be beaten. He slid the door open. A dozen pale, terrified faces stared back at him. Women, huddled in the dark, weeping. In the very back, a young woman, barely more than a girl, clutched a scrap of blue ribbon. "Ah, Maddie!" June screamed. Before June could move, Calder plunged into the boxcar. He grabbed Maddie, dragging her out, wrapping his arm around her throat. He pressed the barrel of his own pistol to her temple. "No one moves," he bellowed, his voice cracking. He held Maddie in front of him, a shield of pale, terrified girlhood. "Back away. Sheriff, all of you, or I will paint the gravel with her brains." The yard went utterly silent. The hissing steam, the distant shouts, the weeping. It all stopped. Calder had the one hostage that mattered. "Let her go! Calder!" The voice came from above. Eli. He was no longer on the dock. He had used the chaos, the reverse lurch of the train, to move. He had climbed the coal tender and was now standing on the narrow, black steel walkway of the car, his rifle in his good hand, aimed not at Calder, but at the sky. He would not risk a shot. "You!" Calder snarled, looking up, his face a mask of sweat and hatred. He tightened his grip on Maddie, making her gasp. "It is over. Red Hawk, I have lost the cargo, but I will have this one. A small price for your interference." "No," June said. Her voice was quiet, dead. She stepped forward into the lantern light. "It is not her you want. It is me, and this." She reached into the bodice of her ruined dress. She pulled out the crumpled, flimsy carbon copy, the proof. M. Hale. Calder's eyes locked onto the paper. Greed and fury warred in his face. He needed that paper. It was the only thing that tied him directly to the crime. "Let her go," June said, her voice shaking but firm. She held the paper out. "Let Maddie go and you can have it. My word." "June! No!" Eli shouted from above. "Give it to me," Calder hissed, his eyes fixed on the paper. "First, let her go," June said. Calder hesitated, calculating. He shoved Maddie forward. The girl stumbled, falling to her knees on the gravel, gasping for air. "Now," Calder demanded, his hand outstretched. June ran to her sister, shoving her behind her, toward the waiting arms of Nora. Then she turned to Calder. She did not hand him the paper. She threw it. She threw it over his head, onto the tracks, into the oily shadows. It was a feint, a moment's desperate gamble. As Calder, with a cry of greed, spun and lunged for the paper, Eli dropped. He did not drop on Calder. He dropped from the coal car onto the steel overpass that ran above the tracks, landing with a heavy, metallic clang. Calder, realizing he had been tricked, spun back, his pistol rising. He fired at June. Eli tackled him. The two men crashed onto the steel grating. Calder's pistol flew from his hand, skittering over the edge and disappearing into the darkness. It was not a fight. It was a desperate, ugly brawl. Calder was a bull, strong and fueled by pure rage. Eli was wounded, fighting with one arm, his stitches tearing, his shoulder a blaze of agony. Calder smashed his fist into Eli's wounded shoulder. Eli roared, a sound of pure animal pain, but his grip did not lessen. He held on, a man defending his home, his life. Calder scrambled, trying to get to his feet. His heavy boots slipped on the grating, which was slick with a fine coating of coal dust and spilled engine oil. He found his footing, raised his fist to strike a final blow, but his boot slipped again. He windmilled his arms, his eyes wide with a sudden, comical shock. He was teetering on the edge of the narrow walkway. He looked at Eli, who was on one knee, gasping, his rifle lost. Eli looked back. His face was a mask of blood and soot. He could have pushed him. He could have ended the man who had burned his land, shot him, and terrorized the woman he did not move. He did not help him. He did not kill him. Calder's boot slipped a final time on the oily dust. He gave a short, sharp cry and pitched backward, falling 10 feet, landing with a sickening wet crunch on the gravel ties below. He was not dead. He was groaning, his leg twisted at an angle that was not human. The last of Calder's gunmen, seeing their leader fall, vanished into the night. Sheriff Amos Gray walked over, his handcuffs dangling from his hand. He looked up at Eli on the overpass, a look of profound, weary respect. Then he looked down at the broken, moaning man on the tracks. "Silas Calder," the sheriff said, his voice flat. "You are under arrest." He snapped the cuffs, securing the colonel to the iron rail. The law, slow and tired, had finally spoken.
From the dark side of the depot, Pike's voice rose in a wail. "I am a man of God. You cannot do this. I demand. I demand." Sheriff Gray did not even look at him. He was looking at Eli, who was slowly, painfully, making his way down. June saw none of it. She was on her knees in the gravel, her arms locked around her sister. Maddie was rail-thin, her hair shorn, her face pale. But she was alive. She was real. June pulled the torn, dirty blue scarf from her braid, her hands shaking so hard she could barely move. Maddie was still clutching the tiny, matching scrap of ribbon she had tied to the basement bar. June pressed her own scarf into Maddie's hand, covering the small, desperate ribbon. "I found you," June whispered. The words choked. "I told you I would come. Maddie, I found you." "June," her sister wept, clinging to her. "You came. You really came." They held each other in the smoky, hissing aftermath, two halves of a single hope, reunited. The blue scarf, a symbol of a promise made 1,000 miles away, lay between them, a silent testament in the wreckage of Calder's broken empire. The train yard was a wreck of spent cartridges, overturned barrels, and the heavy, acrid smell of steam and fear. In the sudden ringing silence, June's world had shrunk to the small, shaking form of her sister, Maddie, kneeling in the gravel. Eli came down from the overpass, his bad shoulder screaming, his face a mask of dried blood and black soot. He moved past the groaning, broken form of Silas Calder, who was now being guarded by Sheriff Gray's grim-faced deputy. The first thing Eli saw was June. She was not looking at him. She was not looking at the victory. She was wrapped around her sister, her back to the entire fight, murmuring, "I found you! I found you!" as if it were the only prayer she knew. Sheriff Amos Gray walked over, his boots crunching on the gravel. He looked at the dozen pale, terrified women who were slowly, fearfully, climbing out of the dark boxcar. "Well, Eli," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion, "you surely do know how to host a town meeting." He turned his attention to the Reverend Pike, who was trying to slip away into the shadows. "Hold on, Reverend," Gray called out. The deputy grabbed Pike, cuffing his hands. "This is blasphemy," Pike shrieked. "I am a man of God. You cannot prove a thing." "I think this will be a good start," Sheriff Gray said. He reached into Pike's waistcoat and pulled out the small, black ledger. He opened it. "It seems you have been taking very careful notes on your sins. Reverend, I am sure the circuit judge will find it fascinating reading." It took 2 days for the judge to arrive. In that time, Dust Creek was a town holding its breath. Calder, his legs shattered, was held in the small-town jail, his high-priced lawyer suddenly silent. Pike was in the cell next to him, weeping and quoting scripture. The 12 women from the boxcar were the town's immediate problem. They had nothing but the thin dresses they wore. Nora, whose own home was a pile of ashes, was the first to act. She marched, with Jed at her side, to the church. She took the keys from the sheriff, unlocked the doors, and declared it open. "It is a sanctuary," she announced to the whispering women on the street. "It is God's house, not Pike's. They will be safe here." But it was not enough room. Eli, his arm now in a proper sling, stood with June. He watched the townspeople bring thin blankets and stale bread, their faces a mixture of pity and suspicion. "We have room," Eli said, his voice low. June looked at him. "Eli, your house—" "It is a house," he said. "It is strong. It can hold them." Maddie and 5 of the other women, the youngest and most frail, went to Cottonwood Ranch. The other 6 stayed at the church, under Nora's fierce protection. The town, shamed into action, began to provide. The trial, when it happened, was brutally fast. The circuit judge, a man with cold eyes and no patience for corruption, listened. He looked at the carbon copy of Maddie's invoice. He looked at Pike's ledger, which detailed 2 years of payments from Calder. He listened to Slocum,
the postmaster, who testified against both men in a desperate, sweating plea to save his own skin. He listened to the testimony of 3 of the women. He listened to Eli. Calder and Pike were found guilty. They were sentenced to 20 years of hard labor in the federal prison at Yuma. As the marshals led them away in chains, Calder passed Eli. His face was gray with pain and hatred. "You have not won, Red Hawk," he hissed. "You have only chosen what to lose." Eli did not answer. He just watched the wagon roll away until it was a speck of dust. The weeks that followed were quiet. The smoke cleared from the sky, leaving a high, clean blue. The scar on the north ridge was a black wound, but the creek still ran, and the cottonwoods had not burned. Life had to be rebuilt. Eli's ranch was crippled, his horses were gone, his tack destroyed, his barn a ruin of slashed grain sacks. He had his land, his house, and his one good arm. Jed and Nora, having lost everything, moved their wagon into the cottonwood grove, becoming Eli's neighbors. Jed and Eli began the slow work of repairing what was broken. They started with the fences. They had no horses to keep in, but a fence was a line. It was a statement. It was a boundary against the world. They salvaged the wood from the north ridge. The burned trees, those that were not turned to ash, were solid at their core. They spent 2 weeks sawing and splitting, the rhythmic sound of their labor a healing balm in the quiet valley. The growing stack of firewood was a promise of winter, a promise that they would survive to see it. The town slowly began to help. It was not the gossips, not the friends of Pike. It was the other small ranchers, the blacksmith, the quiet men who had watched Calder for years and been too afraid to speak. They brought a plow mule. They brought nails. They brought sacks of feed. They did not speak of the trial. They spoke of the fence line and the weather. Maddie and the other women began to heal. The hollow look in their eyes began to recede. Maddie, who was thin as a rail, followed June everywhere, a silent shadow. One evening, the work was done. Jed and Nora were in their wagon. Maddie and the other women were in the main room of the house, mending donated clothes. Their quiet murmurs a new, strange sound in Eli's home. Eli and June were on the porch. It was the first time they had been truly alone since the night of the fire. The silver pendant he had given her, the cottonwood leaf, was cool against her skin under her dress. He sat on the bench, his wounded shoulder stiff. She stood by the railing, watching the darkness settle in the trees. "I am sorry, Eli," she said, her voice so low it was almost part of the wind. He did not move, but she felt his attention sharpen. "I brought this to you," she said, turning to face him. "All of it. You built this place of peace, and I brought fire and bullets. You were shot. You nearly lost everything. Because of me, because I lied to you the day I arrived. I am so sorry." He was quiet for a long time, watching her. "You did not lie," he said finally. "Eli, I pretended." "You did not lie," he repeated, his voice firm. "You were just telling a different kind of truth. You were looking for your sister. You were protecting yourself. That is not a lie. That is survival." He stood up, wincing, and walked to stand beside her. He looked out at the land, his land. Calder was already here. Pike was already here. The rot was in the wood long before you arrived. You did not bring the war. Juniper, you just brought the reason to finally fight it. He looked at her, his dark eyes clear in the twilight. "I could have left you at the depot that first day. I should have. It was the smart thing to do. I could have turned you over to Calder. I could have let the town have you. I could have saved my ranch. And my peace." "Why did you not?" she whispered, her throat tight. "I do not know," he said. He gave a small, rough laugh. I think I had been waiting for a reason not to be peaceful. I had been lonely, and then you came. You shot that bottle. You fixed my shirt. You stood up to Pike. You walked into Calder's house with me. You saved my life in the fire." He reached out with his good hand and touched her face.
his calloused fingers gentle. I chose you, every day. I chose you, over the peace, over the ranch. I would choose you again. I will always choose you. She leaned into his hand, closing her eyes, the simple, profound confession settling in her heart. He was not a man of many words, but the ones he spoke, he meant. The town had to redefine itself. Without Calder's money and Pike's false piety, Dust Creek was smaller, poorer, but cleaner. The real school teacher arrived 2 weeks later on the stagecoach. Her name was Mrs. Agatha Vale, a stern widow from Boston with a spine of pure iron. She looked at the raw schoolhouse, at the handful of children, and at June. You were a printer, you said? Miss Vale asked, her voice sharp. Yes, ma'am. Then you can read and write without moving your lips. Good. I need an assistant. And just like that, June had a new name. She was not the mail-order bride. She was not Eli's partner. She was Miss June, the school teacher's assistant. Maddie began to recover her strength, but she was restless. The fear was gone, but the shadows remained. She needed a trade. I was a printer, June told her one afternoon. An idea forming. And the Gazette office has been empty for a year. The press is just gathering dust. She got the key from the sheriff. She showed Maddie how to clean the type, how to set the letters, how to read the world backward in the composing stick. Maddie, with her artist's eye, took to it immediately. Her hands, which had been pale and shaking, became steady and stained with ink. Her first project was a small flyer. The Dust Creek Women's Cooperative. Laundry, mending, baking, fair prices, honest work. The town, slowly, stopped whispering. They stopped calling Eli the half-breed. He was Mr. Redhawk, the man who had given sanctuary to the women. They stopped calling June the wildest bride. She was Miss June, the teacher. The labels, which had been weapons, had been replaced by names. One evening, in the kitchen at Cottonwood, Maddie was looking at her small, frayed scrap of blue ribbon. I do not know if I can keep this, she whispered. It reminds me of the dark, of his basement. June took her own scarf from her neck. It was torn from Jace's hand, stained with soot and Eli's blood. They are not about the dark, Maddie, she said softly. They are about finding each other. They are our story. She took her sewing kit. She sat at the kitchen table, under the lantern light. She cut 2 clean, small squares from the silk, one from her scarf, one from Maddie's ribbon. She took the simple muslin curtain that hung over the kitchen window, the one that looked out on the cottonwoods. With small, perfect stitches, she sewed the 2 blue squares, side by side, onto the hem. They were not a scar. They were a milestone. A small, bright patch of blue sky. A new, shared horizon, sewn into the fabric of their new home. The first frost came. The burned wood was stacked high. And the house was secure. Eli found June by the creek, watching the water run clear and cold over the stones. He was silent for a long time. He seemed nervous, a feeling she had never seen in him. June, he said. She turned. He held out his hand. In his palm was a thin silver chain. It was not new. It was tarnished, clearly handmade by a Mexican smith, beautiful and old. Hanging from it was a single, small, hammered silver pendant. She looked closer. It was a cottonwood leaf, every vein visible. This was my mother's, he said, his voice low. The cottonwood leaf, to my people. It means the tree of life. It only grows where there is water. It means shelter. It means home. He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. I know it is not what you are used to, but I would be honored if you would wear it. She felt tears well, but she did not let them fall. She knew what he was asking. He was not offering a contract. He was offering a life. She turned her back to him, lifting her hair from her neck. His fingers, rough and scarred from the wire and the firewood,
were incredibly gentle as he fastened the clasp. The silver was cool against her warm skin. She turned back to face him, her hand at her throat. Her fingers closed over the leaf.
Yes,
she whispered.
yes.
The wedding was not held in the church. The church, now scrubbed clean of Pike's hypocrisy, was a women's shelter, a school, and a public meeting hall, and that seemed more sacred than any service. Instead, they stood under the high, rustling canopy of the ancient cottonwood trees at the ranch. It was a clear afternoon in late October, the air sharp and clean, the leaves on the trees a blaze of pale gold. It was not a large affair. Sheriff Amos Gray officiated, his hat in his hands, his voice quiet as he read the simple, legal words from a territorial book. Jed and Nora stood as witnesses, Nora holding her youngest child, her face full of a fierce, quiet joy. Maddie was there, her hands stained with printer's ink, and next to her stood 3 of the women who had been rescued from the boxcar. They were no longer the women. They were Clara, who was a fine baker, Sophie, who was helping Miss Vale at the school, and Anne, who had a quiet, uncanny skill with horses. June wore her one good dress, the gray one, now mended and clean. Around her neck, shining against the plain cotton, was the silver cottonwood leaf. It was the only dowry she had. Eli wore his mended shirt. He stood tall, his shoulder healed, the lines of pain around his eyes finally gone. He did not put a gold ring on her finger. He took her hand, and in his, he held a long, thin strip of woven cloth, dyed a deep blue with indigo. It was a scarf, like hers, but it was from his people. He did not slide it onto her finger. He wrapped it gently around both of their hands, binding them together. "In my mother's way," he said, his voice low and steady for her alone. "This means we are tied, our lives, our work, our home. It is one life." Sheriff Gray cleared his throat. "By the authority of the Arizona Territory," he said, "I pronounce you man and wife." There was no grand celebration. Jed and Nora had brought a jug of cider. Clara had baked a honey cake. They ate and drank on the porch as the sun went down. The sound of quiet laughter, a new and welcome guest in the valley. The Cottonwood Ranch, once a fortress of solitude, was now a home. It was full. The house, which had been built for one, now held a strange, large, and complicated family. June and Eli did not turn the women out. Clara, Sophie, and Anne became, as Eli had stated in the town hall, partners. They were not servants, and they were not guests. They were family, a word June used with the same fierce protection that Nora used for her own children. Clara took over the kitchen, her cornbread and stews filling the house with a warmth it had never known. Sophie, it turned out, was a brilliant bookkeeper, and she took over the ranch ledgers that June had started. Anne, who had been terrified of men, found her peace in the rebuilt barn, and she had a touch with the new mule team that Eli could only describe as magic. They were earning their keep, but more than that, they were earning back their own lives. They were saving their own money. They were, for the first time, independent. Dust Creek had changed. The railroad station was finally built, but it was not at Calder's south pasture. With Calder's fraud exposed, the railroad board had reverted to the original, more sensible plan. The depot was built at the edge of town, a simple, honest building of new lumber. It brought passengers, and it brought freight, but it was governed by federal rules, not by a tyrant's whim. Cottonwood Ranch, now with Jed and Nora as foremen, had the primary contract to supply the railroad crews with beef and hay. It was a transparent contract. The work was honest, and the pay was fair. The rhythm of life settled into a new, steady beat. The mornings were the best. The sun would hit the kitchen window, striking the 2 small, faded blue squares of silk sewn into the curtain, making them glow. The house would be full of the smell of coffee and Clara's cornbread. One morning, Eli sat at the head of the table, not in his customary silence, but reading aloud from the Tucson Daily Star. The newspaper was 3 days old, but it was news from the outside world. His reading, once hesitant, was now strong and fluent. June would often look up from her coffee, listening to the sound of his voice, a quiet pride filling her chest. Maddie was not at the table. She was already at work. She had, with Eli's help, moved the old printing press from the Gazette office into a small, clean shed behind the house. She had found her calling. Her hands were always black with ink, her face smudged, but her eyes were bright. She was printing a new flyer, setting the type with a quick, confident click-clack that was its own kind of music. June walked out to the shed, a hot cup of coffee in her hand. "What is it this week?" she asked. Maddie pulled a fresh sheet from the press, her brow furrowed in concentration. She held it up. The headline was bold and clear: "Safe Passage, a directory of honest work and lodging for women in the Arizona Territory." "I am sending it to the agencies in St. Louis," Maddie said, her voice fierce. "The real ones. So no one else has to come here the way we did, so they know there are safe places, like this one." June felt a swell of pride so strong it ached. Her sister, the victim, was now a protector. That evening, a hard wind kicked up. It was not the hot, dry wind of the fire, but the first cold breath of winter. It carried the scent of pine and the familiar red dust. June and Eli stood on the porch, watching the sky turn a deep, bruised purple. It was the same porch where they had first faced each other in a terrible, confused silence. The wind rattled the shutters, a sound that brought back the memory of the storm, of Pike's knocking, of Calder's rawhide message. June shivered, though it was not from the cold. Eli saw it. He stepped behind her, putting his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He was a solid, warm wall. He had done this in the stone shed, during the fire, but this time it was not survival. It was just comfort. "The wind is rising," she said quietly. "Let it," he murmured, his chin resting on her hair. "If the storm comes again, we will stand on this porch together. We will not hide, and we will not be moved." She leaned back into him, her hand covering his over the cottonwood leaf. The promise was an anchor, stronger than any stone. Later, in the cold darkness of their room, they lay side by side. The wedding had been a simple, public statement. This quiet, was the true marriage. He had not taken her in a blaze of passion, as the dime novels would have written. He had taken her hand and led her to the bedroom, and he had rebuilt the fire in the small hearth, the one he had never used. The firelight cast warm, flickering shadows on the old wooden walls, on the simple furniture. He turned to her, his face soft in the glow. He had been a man defined by his loneliness, the lonely bed, in the lonely house, at the end of the lonely trail. He touched her face, his calloused fingers tracing the line of her jaw, just as he had in the stone shed. "Isa Kappa te," he whispered, "she who wears blue." When he kissed her, it was a sealing of the promise, a quiet confirmation of all the choices that had led them to this one. Safe, warm place. It was a kiss of profound, healing tenderness. And as the firelight danced on the old wooden bed frame, the quiet, empty house was finally, completely full. His lonely bed was lonely no more. Dignity, June thought, was not something given to you by a man with a contract or a preacher with a blessing. It was not a gift from the powerful. It was a thing you reclaimed, piece by piece, with your own 2 hands. It was a fence mended, a flyer printed, a hand taken in the dark. The red dust still blew over the mesas. Dust Creek was still a hard town in a hard land, squeezed between the railroad and the desert, but it was no longer a cruel town. It was a place where people were called by their names. Western freedom, Eli knew, was not the empty space he had once craved. It was not the right to be left alone. It was the right to choose, and to choose decently, It was the right to build a sanctuary in the dust and to stand on the porch together when the storm came. Thank you for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. Please share your thoughts and where you are listening from in the comments below so we can connect. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And if you really want to support the channel, please hit that hype button to help this story reach more listeners.